Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to introduce the keynote address of this conference by Rabbi Delphine Horvilleur. What can the diaspora teach Israel about power in such a time? So before I do so, I would like to honor the presence of His Excellency, Mr. Éric Danon, the Ambassador of France, who generously agreed to come and attend this conference. Rabbi Horvilleur, Professor Yossi Shine, and I are humbled, honored, and deeply grateful to welcome you today. You are one of the finest and most inspiring Jewish thinkers in our turbulent times. We first met Rabbi Horvilleur in 2015 when Professor Shine worked on his opus magnum, The Israeli Century, How the Zionist Revolution Changed History and Reinvented Judaism. We interviewed Delphine Horvilleur in her office in Paris. She responded in her rich, eloquent, and flawless Hebrew. And Delphine is here to speak about power. And I have to say that Professor Shane and I were both blown away by her own power, the power of her thinking, and both agreed that this young woman shall become the leading voice of the French and European Jewish intellectual scene. And so it was. Delphine Horvilleur's own voice became one of the most meaningful and impactful in France. Her intellectual leadership helped guide a disoriented country in the aftermath of Charlie Hebdo, the Bataclan, the Hypercacher killing, the murder of Mireille Knoll and Sarah Halimi, a country wrestling with the return of anti-Semitism, a country whose national identity has become a blind spot. Raised in Nancy, Delphine Horvilleur is the granddaughter of Holocaust survivor. It's important to say because Delphine has had such a rich life that I have the impression that she has already lived a few lives. She studied at Hebrew University of Jerusalem as well as in New York, where she pursued Talmudic studies. And it was during her period in the United States that she decided to pursue rabbinical ordination, which she eventually received from the Hebrew Union College in 2008. Today, Rabbi Horvilleur is the leading rabbi of a large liberal congregation in France, the co-leader of the liberal Jewish movement, and the editor of Tenou'a, a quarterly magazine. But well beyond France, Delphine's voice shapes the Jewish debates in the United States and Israel. She's one of the leading voices of European Jewry, and as such, she was invited to take part in the select international group of intellectuals who drafted the Declaration of Our Common Destiny, a new foundational document of Jewish unity that she presented to President Rivlin in Jerusalem. Delphine Horvilleur is also a best-selling author, both in France and in the United States and Israel. Among her best-selling books, En tenue d'Ève, Féminin, Pudeur et Judaïsme, in Eve's Attire, Modesty, Desire and the Female Body, Réflexion sur la question antisémite, Anti-Semitism Revisited, How the Rabbis Made Sense of Hatred, that came out in English in 2022, Il n'y a pas de hasard, Monologue contre l'identité, and what I believe to be her opus magnum, Vivre avec nos morts, Petit traité de consolation, Living with Our Dead. It was published in English, Japanese, Korean, Romanian, and this week it comes out in Hebrew, Lichiot im Hametim Shelanu, by Locus. Mazal Tov and congratulations for this. I would conclude and say on a personal note that for me, Delphine is not only a star, she's a meteor. She doesn't only shine, she creates a streak of light wherever she goes. And this is important for my generation of French Jews. Thank you for coming, Delphine. Whoa.
Maybe I'll leave now. I don't know. Thank you so much for those words. Thank you for your presence. Do you hear me well? It's okay now? Well, let me first thank you really for this kind invitation to take part in this event. I just landed yesterday night from Paris, and I'm particularly glad to start my journey in Israel with you this morning, with this encounter and with this specific discussion. I know, and I understood it well this morning, the conference is expected to be in English. This is what I will do. I will speak English. But if you allow me, for a few seconds, I would like to start my talk in Hebrew. Don't worry, if you don't understand Hebrew, you're not going to miss anything. This is just part of my demonstration. מאוד מאוד חשוב לי לדבר רק כמה משפטים בעברית. לא שיש לי משהו מסוים שאני לא יכולה להגיד בשפה אחרת, אבל חשוב לי לשנייה להשמיע את המוזיקה ואת הטון ואת אולי המבטא הישראלי. The reason why I wanted to start with a few sentences in Hebrew is just to share with you a very personal experience. As you may notice, in English, I have a French accent. I learned English quite early at school in France, and I spent many years in New York, in the States, but I never managed to lose my accent. But in Hebrew, most of the time, people don't hear my accent, at least for a while, you know. And I learned Hebrew quite late in my life. I was already an adult, and I lived much longer in America than in Israel. But for some reason, most of the time, people think, when I'm in Israel, people think when I speak that I was born here. And generally, it takes a few minutes or an entire conversation to realize that I might be a foreigner, but I can easily pretend for a few sentences that I'm local, born and raised in Israel, tzabar, tzabarit. I can perfectly imitate the Israeli accent in all the languages that I speak, in French and in English. And I can do what the Israelis call with this beautiful expression, ke'ilu. I can really do ke'ilu, pretend it's very natural for me. So you might think that this easy communication in Hebrew is a very useful tool for my dialogue with Israel in the way I managed maybe to share my concerns, my feelings, my work here. And it's actually totally wrong. In the past 15 years, as you said, I published books that were translated in Korean and Japanese and many languages, and I gave lectures all over the world, just like many of you, I'm sure, in this room. But I have to share with you a feeling I have for years. It seems to me that Israel is the place where, for me, the conversation is the most inhibited. Like something is blocked, or something in the conversation is made of misunderstanding, as if here, more than anywhere else, I had a hard time making myself understood, as if there was a kind of built-in, lost in translation, as the American says, an impossibility to create a real conversations about issues I really deeply care about. So you might say, and you would probably be right, who cares? You know, why should I share those personal frustrations? Why am I sharing them today? Well, I wanted to start with this confession because I think it's totally linked to the topic we try to address today here. Why is the conversation between Israelis and diaspora Jewry so complex today? Why does it seem to many of us that the dialogue stands still and is a bit maybe in a frozen state? Why is it so hard to understand each other even when we think we speak the same language almost without accent? So it's not, as we tend to believe, I think, it's not a question of tensions between orthodoxy and liberal streams of Judaism. It's not just a question of fight between conservative and progressive voices or political concerns about the future of Zionism. No, I think it touches something deeper that has to do with the very core of our Jewish experience or our Jewish ethos. In recent years, as you mentioned, Sarah, thank you, I wrote books about Jewish identity, the relationship between femininity, Judaism, misogyny, and anti-Semitism. I wrote about interfaith dialogues and about Jewish rituals. But somehow, At the core of those topics, I realized that I kept teaching about more or less the same idea that I could sum up this way. Jewish identity always has something to do with what I would call an acknowledged brokenness. Judaism is obsessed in its stories and in its rites and its narratives with fragility, vulnerability of the structure, and builds itself around the idea of a certain uncompletedness. This is how I would call it. Let me try to be clearer, maybe by giving you some elements taken from sacred texts, taken from ancient rituals. I could give you so many examples. Let's say that, in the Bible, God promises Abram a land. He seals with Abram a covenant, and Abram splits animals in pieces. You remember this passage from the Bible? It's called Brit Ben Abetarim. Abram splits animals in two. Then later, Moses comes down from Mount Sinai with the stone tablets in his hand. What is the first thing he does when he comes down at Mount Sinai? Clash! He breaks the tablets. The temple is built once, twice, and twice. It's broken. It's destroyed. When we tell the story of the Exodus around our tables on Pesach, before we start the story, what do? Yachatz, we break the matzah. When we bake challah, we make sure that a portion of the dough is separated, cut from the rest. When we earn money, we make sure to give ma'asar. A portion is taken from what we own to be given away. When we build a house, we always leave a little piece of the house supposedly unfinished or a bit broken. When we get married, we break a glass. When a baby boy enters the covenant, we cut something. So you get the idea. You get the idea. Jewish stories and rituals seem to constantly repeat the pattern, a certain refusal of completedness, a certain way to deal with what is not full, what is broken, shattered, partially removed. We never own anything completely, but constantly we repeat the gesture of getting rid of a piece, of the fullness. By the way, I think it has a lot to do with the hate against Jews along history. I think they are always perceived to be breaking agents, people who prevent a society to perceive itself as totally complete. And I think it also has to do, obviously, with the historical Jewish experience that comes from the exilic heritage, the fact that along history, Jews didn't own land, didn't have sovereignty, not as a choice, but as a consequence of discriminations. So you see both historical context and Jewish wisdoms probably offer Jewish identity a certain experience of vulnerability and, other people said it before me today, a kind of awareness of the other with a big O, because Jews have been that other, conscious of those around them who were set apart, scapegoats, foreigners, etc., those who were perceived by the majority to be a breach in the integrity of the group or the integrity of the nation. And this exilic experience has a lot to do with a consciousness shared by many of us, a certain experience of powerlessness, the need to build the right alliances to try to counter our inherent vulnerability. And it's no big surprise that often the diaspora-Israel conversation is very complex on those issues, on the question of power, because historically, the Zionist project was an attempt to create a different Jewish identity, to create, sometimes the idea was brought forth, to create another Jew, a more complete one, authentic one who finally wouldn't be the other in its society, but the same, a Jew who would build a society kechol agoyim, just like other nations, a Jew that would experience maybe muscular strength, military power, political power, redemption, sovereignty, a Jew that would live a form of completedness, an unbroken form of himself. And sometimes, it seems to me that the conversation is broken because the Israelis learned to perceive themselves as unbreakable, in a way. When I used to live here in the 90s, a long time ago, I was quite fascinated by an Israeli expression that kept coming back in the conversation. My friends would always tell me, "Lo latzet frayer." Like, don't be a friar, which is something like, don't be a loser, but I'm sure there's probably a better translation for this concept of friar. But this familiar Israeli expression really impressed me because I always felt that my Jewish identity was a kind of friar experience. It was rather, if I would say it more positively, it was a certain genius of the diaspora to make something creative out of a loser experience, to build on the failure. And I know exactly what some of you maybe now think or say. Having a nation, building sovereignty, leading policy, requires to exercise strength. And even, of course, a form of violence that the diasporic experience exempted us from. Israel needs power and strength, and it's a matter of survival, will argue many. And I know all that. But precisely because I'm aware of that discourse, I believe that more than ever, the conversations between the voice of Israel and the voices of the exile is an emergency. More than ever, I think that we need to figure out how to move beyond our current lost in translation experience. When Yossi invited me, I immediately said yes. Of course, I plan to come to Israel because my book is finally released this week in Hebrew. But in the invitation you sent me, Yossi, I was particularly struck by the biblical verse, indeed, that you chose for this day. You took a verse from the book of Esther, chapter 4, "Go gather together all the Jews." I was impressed because I think that if there is one book in the Bible that warns us against the threats of power, its abuse, and the problem of sovereignty and political violence and relationship to exile, it's probably the book of Esther. You remember the story, very short, in that book. The powerful, the king, obsessed with his power, names a very bad advisor, and the kingdom is obsessed with owning lands, 127 countries, owning money, luxury items and drinks and banquets in the palace, owning women, obviously. And this power opens the door to a terrible violence against minorities, against women, of course, but very soon against the Jews. And salvation comes not from above, not from a miracle. There is no powerful hand, yad chazakah, like in Pesach, no plagues, no opening of the sea. In Purim, the salvation comes from the powerless, the most vulnerable of all, a Jew and a woman. Esther actually carries her double identity, Jewish and woman. So if you allow me this play on words, she has no otzma. She has no otzma, no power, no real power. Nevertheless, as the verse says, who knows if you didn't come to this position for this time? And Esther gains power from her powerlessness. And this way she changes history. This is generally how people read the Megillah of Esther. And generally they stop the commentary there. The Jews were threatened. The Jews were saved. Yofi, great, let's eat. Most of the time, they prefer, and I understand, not to read or not to comment the end of the text, but you probably know the end of the text, chapter 9 of the Megillah, Jews take revenge. Suddenly, they have power. Suddenly, they're in charge of the land. Mordechai is the new prime minister, and they organize a very nice day of killing of their enemies. And because it's nice, They ask the permission to start again the following day, pogrom time in ancient Persia. Great. Of course, you get all the idea of this last chapter, or almost last chapter of the Megillah. For the careful reader, it raises here a very powerful political question. If, as a minority, you're threatened and vulnerable, how can you be sure, while you gain power, otzma, that you won't behave just like your enemies? How can you be sure that you will not use the same violence? In the Megillah, there is, I believe, a very powerful warning against power abuse, against what threatens every sovereignty, every power. And it says that in order to build a policy lo kechol hagoyim, not like the other nations, one should be particularly concerned with ethical matters. I would also like to add that the book of Esther is the place where the Jews are born. You know, in the Torah, obviously, no one speaks about the Jews. You know, they are Hebrews, they are Israelites, but there are no Jews, Yehudim. And suddenly, a man from the tribe of Benjamin is suddenly called in the book of Esther, Mordechai a-Yehudi. He's a Benjaminite, but he's called Yehudi, not from the tribe of Judah. You see, it's suddenly the use of the word becomes the one we use. You see that the Jewish identity is in the Bible, born in exile, not in Israel. Actually, it's true of other identities we carry when we speak about Hebrew identity. Where is born the Hebrew identity? It's born with Abram in Chaldea, Ur Chaldea. And it's also the same with the Israelite, Bnei Israel. The Israelite identity as a collective is born where? In Egypt, not in Israel. So you see, it's in a very paradoxical way, all the names we carry to define ourselves as Jews have to do with what we acquired in exile. The exile named us. And this is precisely where I would like to lead you today in our conversation, how to renew a discussion between Israel and the diaspora that seems to be broken. A few weeks ago, you probably heard that speech. I heard a speech given by David Grossman during one of the recent demonstrations in Tel Aviv. Grossman said he was worried, and he said that night, for the first time in my life, I feel like a stranger in my own country. And I guess that in his mouth and in the ears of many Israelis, it sounded like a threat or a tragedy. But I have to admit that for me, a gate opened that night. I felt somehow that finally my diasporic experience and the Israeli experience of many of my friends could dialogue in a particular way in this feeling that the otherness we both experience could create new alliances and could give us the power of the exile even when we are home. And this is where I would like to go for my conclusion. Before we may engage in this conclusion, before we engage together in a second in a conversation, I spoke now about feeling home. When I think of the Israeli home, I always have in mind the image of the Knesset, this Israeli parliament, supposedly the home of the precious Israeli democracy. A few years ago, in the 90s, as I said, when I was a student, I used to live in Jerusalem, and at the time I was studying medicine, and some of my classes took place at the campus of Givat Ram, which is the scientific campus in Jerusalem, just in front of the Knesset. And I used to start sometime my days there at the Knesset. I would go early to listen to debate. I know it's weird probably, but it was part of some of my days. And I remember hearing there sometimes the way the spokesperson would start the day. In the morning, he would give the date. Normal thing. Imagine now we are this morning standing at the Knesset. So we probably would hear, we are today, the 12th day of the Hebrew month of Iyar, of the year 5783. And then the spokesperson would add, May the 3rd, 2023, Al pi minyanam. You know that expression? According to their account. Al pi minyanam. It's a classical Talmudic expression. What does it mean? Well, it means al pi minyanam shel hagoyim, according to the counting of the nations of the non-Jews. But here is the problem, or should I say the funny detail. The Hebrew calendar, Tishri, Cheshvan, Kislev, Tevet, Shevat, Adar, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av, Elul, all those Hebrew names are not Hebrew, because those words comes from the Babylonian calendar. We borrowed them from the Babylonian calendar. Our ancestors in exile in Babylon adopted the local calendar and they made it theirs. So to say it more clearly, the Hebrew calendar is also al pi minyanam. It's borrowed. It's influenced by our diasporic experience, by the culture of the exile. But wait, it doesn't stop there. We just celebrated Pesach, the most sacred narrative of the Jewish people. How did we do so? We did it by reclining on our chairs this way, dipping vegetables in salt water. Why? Because we reproduced a Greco-Roman symposium our ancestors experienced while they were under Hellenic domination. And we talk about Purim and Esther. Year after year, we celebrate a very Jewish story, indeed. And we do it how? Through a carnival that reproduces what used to be celebrated by pagans in ancient Persia, where they worshipped Ishtar, Esther, Ishtar. So of course the story is different and the message is completely different. But still, think about it. It keeps the trace and the memory of our exilic story. The voice of the exile keeps whispering in our purely Jewish narrative. And it's true of almost every Jewish holiday and of so many ritual moments we have. It's charged with, you know, in a way, signs and civilizations we encountered, civilizations that changed us and build us. We pretend to speak Hebrew without accent, but actually even without accent, our language is deeply sedimented, haunted by the exile we carry with us, even when we are truly, truly home. So today, I think, is an historic moment. Because I think we have a chance, if we want, to renew a dialogue or to bridge what has separated Israel from the diaspora through a simple acknowledgement, one that is formulated again and again in the Torah. Remember you were a stranger. Remember to love the stranger. You know the heart of the stranger. And therefore, if you care about the other and the powerless, you might find the power, the other power, to transform an ancient dream into an enduring reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Rabbi Horvilleur for her speech. It reminds me of the beautiful book by Václav Havel, The Power of the Powerless. And they succeeded. So we're going to take a round of questions. I'm going to repeat the questions because we have a lot of watchers online. So I'm going to start here, please. Yes. Maybe we'll take a few questions. Thank you very much. This was the question I'm going to repeat about power and powerlessness, and to what extent Jewishness is connected to power or powerlessness, and what is the way ahead or the middle way that could be found. Other questions? Yes, Ronnie Klein.
Thank you. I think I need to answer because I'm going to forget the questions.
So just as a reminder, the second question is about the meaning of sovereignty in Jewish tradition, and what can French Jews bring to Israelis given the fact that Israelis think they know everything. Delphine, your turn.
So Israelis know everything. I want to share with you this experience I have with the publishing of my book. I think it's quite interesting. As I said, the book Vivre avec nos morts, it was like a big bestseller translated to many, many languages. And the only place we couldn't publish it was Israel. I mean, really, I had so many conversations with my editor in France, publisher, and somehow the reason was, and I think you're not going to be surprised, always we had a hard time finding a publishing house here, because somehow in Israel, people believe that because it's a book about Judaism, they kind of have nothing to learn from the diaspora. If it was a book about politics or something else, it would be published. But because it was really centered on Jewish thought, they felt, many of them, that they have enough, like they have enough home of this discourse, and maybe we don't need to hear something from abroad. So it goes well with what you just said. So indeed, I think you mentioned, and I think it brings back all the questions together. What is the Jewish model of power if we have been powerless? Of course, powerlessness cannot be a political program. I mean, it's like in the last panel, someone said you have to be utopian, but then when you're a pragmatist, you have to get rid of some of your utopia. So I think there is in the Bible, there are models of Jewish powers that we particularly now need to go back to. You mentioned them a minute ago in the book of Shmuel and in the Kings. We are always brought with the idea, always is put forward the idea of counterpowers. Indeed, I think it's very interesting to speak about it now. The idea that there is a king, but the king is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The king is above. There should be no human king, in the Torah.
It's changing.
Yeah. So there should be. Yeah, it's interesting because Deuteronomy suggests that, there should be no kings. But if you place a king above the people, if the people really want a king, so Deuteronomy says, you should make sure he's one of yours, is not above his brothers, and you should make sure, it's interesting, that he has not too many horses, too much money, and not too many wives. Why? So you understand you can understand it in different ways. What are horses? Horses are the military power. If you have horses, you can go to war. What is money? Money is the financial power. You should make sure it doesn't own too much economic power. And what are women? In ancient civilization, women is the way you build peace or alliances with neighbors. So it's foreign policy. So you should make sure that the king doesn't have his hand on the ministry of the military. He should take his hands off of the foreign affair also, and off the financial business. So it's quite an interesting model. But also, I think it's interesting when you look at the Jewish calendar. Again, I'm going back to Jewish calendar. How is the Jewish calendar built? It starts not in Rosh Hashanah. In the Bible, it starts with Pesach, Nisan, and where does it end? The last holiday is Purim, in the last month of the biblical year. So basically, in Jewish time, you start in Nisan, and you end with Adar. You start with Pesach, and you end with Purim. What do we learn in Pesach? We learn that there is a king, a very mean king. His name is Pharaoh, and he owns a lot of horses who run after us out of Egypt. And we end the year with another king, a kind of stupid king, Achashverosh, who makes abuse of power. And what does he have? Too much money and too many wives. So you have in the Jewish calendar two models of power that we should never imitate. So how do we not imitate those powers? By creating the biblical separation of powers. Melech, Cohen, Navi. Basically, that's sometimes we had Shofet, Mishkan, Shofet. Sometimes the Shofet is the Navi, like Samuel is both a Shofet and a Navi. So the king is God, but sometimes we empower someone who should be limited in his power. Cohen, who is Cohen? Is maybe in Israel the Rabbanut. I don't know. I don't know. Cohen is in charge of whatever persists in the world. The Cohen is in charge of purity and is in charge of repetition. It tells you for a system to be solid, something needs to go on. Something needs to be repeated every day, every month, every year. But then you need the Navi, which some people might say is the role of Bet Mishpat Elyon. I don't know. But the Navi is supposedly the voice of the counterpower. It has to be someone who says, okay, what you do is not right. It might be the right, R-I-T-E, but it's not right, R-I-G-H-T, you know. It's the right and it's not right. And something needs to change. The prophet is the sand in the machine. You know, it always creates a counterpower to the Kohen. And I think it's a very powerful model to explore, I believe, for Jewish sovereignty, to always wonder in our system, wherever we stand, what we keep carrying from the exile, from the gerut that is built in our system. But when we settle and we finally reach the land that was promised to our ancestor, we should make sure that we don't go back to Egypt spiritually, and we don't go back to Persia spiritually. And also, and it's a very interesting sentence from Leviticus. Leviticus says, you should not imitate the worships of the Canaanians. What were the worships of the Canaanians? Friends, remember, the Canaanians had a cult to the divinity of Baal. Baal is the name of a Canaanian god, but in Hebrew, what does it mean? Owner. Do not, never worship ownership, because if you believe you're Balabait, then your Judaism is threatened. And I'm sorry, I'm bringing now a very political image, but I was struck in the last election to realize that this was the slogan of Otzma Yehudit. They wrote on their poster, "Mi en Baalei Habayit." Like it's weird to choose in a Jewish state to affirm that your legitimacy and your status comes from Baalut, from owning, because it's really totally opposite to what I believe Jewish spirituality, if we may use that word, is about.
Yeah, we'll take one or two final questions. One question. Yeah, Professor Denis Charbit, please.
In what sense do you think that Jewish war differ from American war, French war, universal?
Wars?
I'm sorry, I was told to repeat the question. In what sense do the Jewish wars differ from the French ones or the American ones?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I'm not sure I can answer this question. I have to take a class with you. I think French wars somehow always end with the fact that you cut someone's head. And, you know, we do experience it today with the way the reforms that Macron is trying to implement launch, you know, this, it always gives the feeling, I'm talking now in the presence of the French ambassador, so I'm trying to measure my words. But I think he would agree with me saying that it's very, very difficult to reform anything in the French system, because there is something that keeps repeating itself in a way, that keeps repeating this, that you need to reach this point, this breaking point of the French Revolution to make sure something might change. Before that, people will be in the street. I remember it took me time to understand that, but when I used to live in Israel, I remember one day with my friends at the university, we played this game when they ask people, we're gonna now mimic countries, and you'll have to figure out which country we're talking about. And someone, you know, stood and you, no, started to complain, and everybody understood it was France and not me. Because the way people represent France, yeah, so I think the fight is somehow, that keeps coming back, is the fight for the French Revolution. But I think what I'm saying now probably works for other countries. In a way, we never invent something in a culture. We keep repeating, past scenarios. So I don't know, to answer your question, we need to figure out what is exactly the typical scenario. It's not easy for the Jewish wars because, we fought very different wars, and the Jewish calendar testifies pretty much about that. There's this joke that we talk about in a second, that actually you can sum up all the Jewish calendars saying they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. So probably a Jewish war would be about food. I don't know. No, but frankly, I don't know. That's a great question. I would have to consider.
So on this note, I would like to thank Delphine Horvilleur and give her the book this is the reason for what we interviewed her and met with her for the first time. So this is a present for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.